introduction. I'm happy to see you once again, and some new faces. But I'm sure we will have a great time. Coincidentally, 2 people taught me here. Yeah. Reverend Simon Fete, Reverend Samson Malaysia. And there was a introduction to the Bible and the law, something like that. It was some sort of module 10 years ago. So, federalism is a topic I'm really passionate about. It's a topic I've disagreed with people about. But it's a topic I love. I feel, I breathe, I smell, I touch. You know, I'm very passionate about it. So, perhaps we could have a little background to know what could have informed my interest in this particular topic. Here at UC they teach about worldviews, and partly our worldviews are influenced from where we stay, where we have been raised. And for me, my family background has a major role to play with what kind of interest I have in this particular topic. I remember that time I was born, the Kalakaship had been abolished and several other cultural institutions. But then, there was vibrancy for restoration of the same. And I remember watching the proceedings of the coronation of Kalakarono William TV II and Nagaland Window. Over time, UTV, which is now UBC, used to air it every time that the anniversary came around. So that is partly my parents. I remember them teaching me how to say my name, my lineage, how to greet. Those, behave like in Uganda. So this is not to say that federalism is to do with Uganda, or is Uganda, or strictly about Uganda. No. This is what informed my interest in it, because the institution of the Kalakaship identifies with that. And in school, there was such debates. I'm sure most of you could have had similar debates between the Kalaka and the president, who's strongest, who's most respectful, who wants more power, more prestige, more territory, and those kind of things. We had those kind of debates. Then there were political debates on federal, on radio. I remember especially between the period 2000-2005. Between 2000 to 2005, that is between my primary 6 and senior 4. So how do I get to have a chance to listen to these debates? Because my parents, particularly my father, often tuned in political debates. So I would listen in on Saturdays. But in school, I had friends who had also radio. And there was agitation, especially if you remember that in 1995, after the promulgation of the 1995 Constitution, there were still heirs that were not sorted between different regions or within amongst the citizens about what exactly was included in the Constitution vis-a-vis what they had recommended to the local commission, the one that did studies and produced a report for enacting the Constitution and the eventual promulgation of the same. So I trounced on radio programs, television, newspapers, magazines, internet during that period. And when I came to university, it wasn't any different. Now university was even more, should I say, cosmopolitan or metropolitan, or of that nature. And so, as one of the things we would do during one of the meetings by Platform Revolution, there was a cultural debate, I think, in Ukoyo sometime, and some of the topics related to this, and I was eager always to participate. But also I've done a bit of research and interested myself in the subject, and in those particular areas of law, politics, governance, culture, and theology. And you will try to follow it those are captured in this presentation as well. So the research at university, my undergraduate research was published into a small book. It is this one over here. Because I was particularly thinking I should have my opinion, published at a later stage. But there is another book, Protection Patronage of Land. This one is more objective than mine. I think for me I was a bit more passionate about the subject. But this one is a bit more objective. This is by Apollo. It is about British machinations and Uganda's struggle for independence. Uganda, meaning also Uganda, the reason why it is put, this is a toponym. So this is Uganda, but as well as Uganda's struggle for independence. Federalism, it is true, has caused lots of misunderstandings within different people, or amongst different people, or different communities. And that's notwithstanding their age, their education status, their social status, their economic status. You find that they have some of these views. So, some of the understandings or misunderstandings of federalism is that it is the rule of the Kabaka over all citizens of Uganda. How many think that is true? Maybe not. The restoration of Uganda's lost glory to the humiliation of all non-Baganda. These days, the category for about 3 years has been mentioning Uganda from Gitco. Maybe there is some truth in restoring that glory. Expulsion of non-Baganda from Uganda. In 2009, there were incidents here when there were riots. The Kabaka had been stopped from going to Bugere, one of the counties forming part of this kingdom, because of a minority group there which was being used, I think, to frustrate programs. But I remember that I was at university at the time. And one of my friends, I had many friends, especially those from Western Uganda, Chigezi and onwards. And there was a bit of anxiety, but also apprehension about how, especially if they thought I was conservative, maybe I would, be evil. Like what other people were doing to their kind. And one of them asked me, would you protect me if I were attacked, or if I was under attack? And my response was yes, but I don't know to what extent. But you could imagine the insecurity that cropped up during that time. It could have led to the sentiment that probably at one point non-Baganda could be expelled from Uganda, just like Indians. But I'm here to dispel those kinds of sentiments. Uganda's independence and or secession from the state of Uganda. That has been one other fear by Ugandans. And often mention the sentiment, a state within a state is what we are looking out for. The supremacy of kingdoms and chiefdoms, hence feudalism. Those of you who have studied law of torts, know the concept of feudalism. The landed gentry vis-a-vis the peasants or the peasantry. The lords and nobles vis-a-vis the commons. The return of Ebyafe, or our things, is the traditional status quo of the haves and the have-nots. These are really sentiments people might have, so that I discovered that they have during my study. Loyal partists, members of political parties, this is what I'm talking about, who are very loyal to their parties, which don't subscribe particularly to the federal idea or concept, view these as something they wouldn't want to associate with, or they wouldn't want to be associated with. Then there are our misguided and misguiding politicians who usually say federalism means tribalism and exploitation of certain people. Our main friends from NRM, staunch. Some of them gave me their views that this was anti-government policy. or anti-government idea, and which automatically means anti-Museveni, a treasonable act. Die-hard Republicans, federalism is as good as returning to medieval times. Medieval times. During the medieval times, the Baganda were wearing back clothes. But in my view, this is the reality and this is the truth. Federalism has nothing to do with those sentiments. Politics, circumstances could elevate the view of federalism or any other form of government to such sentiments. But far from that, federalism refers to a system of governance where power, responsibilities, and economic resources are shared between the central government, usually called the federal government, and the state governments or provinces or regional governments. And it is usually entrenched in a constitutional arrangement. The powers are constitutionally defined and agreed upon. Similarly for the responsibilities, similarly for the sharing of resources. In fact, there should be even a formula to be used in sharing for resources, because in our history, one of the problems we had when we had the Federal Constitution in 1962 was that some money, a certain amount, was agreed to be given to the federal states. Uganda was full federal state, Bunyoro, Ankole, Toro, and the territory of Soga were semi-federal states. So the amount of money they were given under the budget could not increase, notwithstanding the economic changes. So the formula, if it is entrenched in the Constitution, helps circumvent that kind of problem. The functions of government are divided in such a way that the central government has power to regulate certain matters for the whole territory. So the government of Uganda, headed by President Museveni, has power to regulate matters over the whole of Uganda. And a collection of state governments, so you mentioned Uganda, Ankole, Karamoja, Toro, Teso, etc., have power to regulate matters within their component parts, within their own spheres of influence. This is a semblance of what would happen. On the extreme left, those are some of the functions of the central government. What would be some of the functions of the central government? In the middle, those are the shared functions or responsibilities. And on the extreme right, those are the state or provincial government. So these are exclusively managed by the central government or the federal government. Those are shared, and the other ones are exclusively for the state governments. Why? The government, really the concept of federalism is to help lessen the burden of the central government in how it should extend social services and otherwise to the people. That burden is shared by the state governments or the provincial governments or the regional governments to make it more effective. To make it more effective. Part of the argument has always been that the central government argument has always been that Uganda is too small to be divided into federal states. But how many districts do we have in Uganda? The last time I think I counted, there were about 120 something. 122? So that's a wrong analysis or a wrong view. But two, it's not about size of territory or even size of the economy. No. The most visible example perhaps we have in the world is the United States. Are all the states having the same size? Territorial size? Not quite. Do they have the same economic muscle? No. Are they federal states? Yes. Do they feel inferior? Do the ones who are less economically empowered and less in territory feel inferior compared to the bigger states with a bigger financial muscle? No. They have equal rights and responsibilities over their own affairs. And in-house affairs is one thing that federalism would help us to achieve, managing our own in-house issues. Before, there are certain matters that the central government cannot really deal with. For example, things to do with cultural norms and practices. Can the central government make laws to regulate cultural practices effectively, as compared to the case when these actual federal states do that for themselves? They have a fine understanding how, for example, in Uganda, which I'm most familiar with, we have a Dilo Lyakatikiro, which solves clan disputes among clan leaders. And the Kabaka has rulings. In fact, we have modified, we have law reports similar to what you have. We write them in Uganda. I've also witnessed law reports prior to the abolition of the institution of the Kabakaship and other cultural institutions. Recorded cases, plaintiff versus defendant, Omuwabi versus Omwawabirwa. That was developing. The laws, even the national laws, were being translated for the people to understand them. How many people really understand the laws that are passed by the parliament in a foreign language? So that is really part of the, how do you, for example, install a king in Acholi or in Ankole? The government cannot legislate on that because it doesn't have the knowledge or the technical know-how. But there are people within that cultural setting who know how things should be done. Burial rights, succession, and so on and so forth. I've always important for us to know these four things about federalism. If there is anything, we must not forget after this, but forget all the rest except this. One, that the most important aspect of a federal system is that it recognizes that there are different types of political issues. This could be ranging from governance, from sharing power, from who should be the head of us, what system of governance. The 1995 Constitution under Article 1 and 2 mentions that power belongs to the people, but also those people have the power to determine how they should be governed. The Constitution under Article 2 is the supreme law. So under Article 1, they have the power to choose how they should be governed, who should govern them as well. So partly of the problem we have in Uganda, or we've had in Uganda since we became an entity, is because we have different political issues, different systems of political administration. It's not the case that everywhere in Uganda we have centralized societies. No, some are centralized, some are non-centralized. Some have actually just become centralized of recent with the creation of new chiefdoms or kingdoms, as the case may be. But that also points to the issue of self-determination, which is a right, an international right, if you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and the other conventions on political and socio-economic rights. Then, there are different types of institutions to deal with them. You cannot be doing the work alone. That's why even within the central government system or the presidential system that we have, there are organs doing particular things. There was at one point when these things were fused into one man. Is the head of the government, head of state, head of, chairing what would be parliament, which was military council, making the laws, decrees, and so on and so forth. Force the judiciary out, including murdering the Chief Justice. Even today, there are instances where we failed to distinguish between the state and the government and the other institutions. In fact, I remember that when President Museveni had just come to power, he was chairman of High Command, meaning he was the commander-in-chief. 2, he was chairman of the NRSC, which was the National Resistance Council, equivalent of parliament. In fact, there are times if he wasn't sure that the person chairing on his behalf at that time would not be able to steer the debate in a certain direction, he would ambush and come and sit and chair the session and, have the matter resolved his way. And he was, the High Command at that time was meeting punishment or justice against offenders. And at At that time, there was no enabling law that gave the High Command even to sentence people to death or to imprisonment or for whatever other punishment they had in mind. But they were doing it, and he was the chairman. So the one time we had this fusion, it's part of the problem. And some of these political issues affect particular areas, local areas. One might ask, don't we have all the same challenges in Uganda? Generally, yes. More specifically, no. The land challenge is not as rife in Acholi as it is in Uganda. Okay, we could talk about clan disputes. In my short stint at Mengo, I think I've witnessed about 20 clan disputes. 20. So and so is not supposed to be head of clan, so and so is, the magnitude of that problem might not be the same as it is in another cultural area. For example, our friends in Mwesigwa have had challenges with the way the rest of Ugandans view them. In fact, there have been sad comedy made against them. That challenge, perhaps, I'm very experienced in some disregard. Then, that the institutions of government should reflect that there are different political issues to be managed by different types of institutions, which might be specific to particular areas, and therefore government should acknowledge that, and in its workings reflect that in the policies, in the laws, and so on and so forth. The idea that government should be based solely on central institutions is old-fashioned. And out of date. So, proponents of over-centralized systems of government, in my view, hold an old-fashioned worldview, and they are outdated. If there is anything you would love to use to simplify federalism or as a concept, let me give you two analogies or three. One, Makerere University. Now I'm breaking it down. Makerere University had challenges with managing its population, student population, and also staff issues. What did they do? They had to decentralize some of the powers. So they created federal colleges, semi-autonomous. So you find that what was formerly called, for example, Faculty of Law, is called, I think now today, for them they refused, they want to call themselves School of Law. But other colleges, you find College of Social Sciences, College of Education and something, College of, and they have principals who would be the equivalent of governors in those colleges. So they have mini administrations there. They are still compliant with the main administration system, but they are left to manage the local affairs of the college. Because they know them best, they, instead of, doing the bureaucratic process that's been stringent with Makerere for a long time, that has solved some of the issues. In fact, some of the colleges have become more enterprising because some of the decisions have been made at the local level and not in the Senate, where usually they are thrown out. The other bit is the Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church has one central authority, the Pope in Rome. But how is the Pope able to appoint bishops everywhere in the world? Or even to follow up on issues in those countries? In fact, we have a papal nuncio here, who is the equivalent of an ambassador of the Pope in Rome. The appointments come from Rome, but there are councils that sit here. I think there's the Episcopal Council, which sits and recommends, and then issues are looked at by Rome, and then eventually decisions made. So the bishops here have power to do certain things. They can even inform Rome later without having to go through that whole bureaucratic process. UCU has constituent colleges. So this idea is not far-fetched, as people want us to believe. You see, as concerned colleges, it has a relationship with them. They are semi-autonomous. In fact, one of them became fully autonomous. It's called Bishop Stewart University. Became fully autonomous, now a chartered university. This is a semblance of what federal system in Uganda would look like. This is just a proposal. The image is not as clear as it should have been. But those are some of them, 11 proposed states, vis-a-vis the 122 districts. So districts, or districtization of Uganda, has been one of the short-changing things that the government was doing in what they call decentralization of their authority down to local governments. But in actual fact, most of those local governments don't have power actually to make decisions of their own. They have to go back to the center for approval. We have seen some of their headquarters. They hire shops, retail shops. A new district hires a retail shop. They cannot even manage the budget that they're given. They've never handled 1 billion shillings, not even 100 million shillings. So they don't know how to use it, they don't know how to account for it, they don't know how to make it purposeful for the people to benefit. I mentioned that one of my interests is theology, so I discovered that actual federalism has a theological aspect to it, and there's evidence in the Bible. It's termed covenant theology by reformists, or people who are part of the Reformation, or who subscribe to the Reformation theology. And under covenant theology, covenant is the equivalent of omkago. Omkago, I don't know what they call it in language, but it is something that cannot be easily broken, or cannot even be broken at all. So it is there, permanent, and basically helps in relations between the parties concerned. So I don't think I want to bore you with that, but those are some of the covenants that God enabled us to have with our ancestors, and eventually until He Himself came and established a fresh new covenant with us. So what is this malaise? What is this disease that is eating us up as Uganda? Because we could have made major strides in all spheres as a country. But what is it that is in the bottleneck for us to make that excellence, to make those strides we want? So this is my diagnosis. It is multifold because the symptoms are just too many, so I've categorized them. They are historical symptoms, and these are of colonial nature. Most of you who did history out of the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885. At that Berlin Conference, certain people or powers, imperial powers, sat at a table somewhere in Berlin, in Germany, in what they termed the scramble and partition of Africa. Amongst themselves, they had their issues back in Europe. Who is the strongest on the continent? Who is the most economically powerful? You know, who wields more territory? The need for raw materials, because it was an industrial revolution at the time, cheap labor, and those things. So we sat there. I don't know whether you can note, the map of Africa is somewhere there at the top. Someone is pointing at it. This conference was chaired by who? Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of Prussia. Now, that's how they shared Africa. The parts in red, that's Britain, eating almost the whole of the Horn of Africa, and a bit of the south. Then in yellow you have Germany. So that actually, let's go in the order. Britain took their lion's share, followed by France, followed by Germany, Italy, Belgium, Portugal, Spain. The interesting point about this map is that for Belgium, the territory was owned by one man, King Leopold. King Leopold, on that whole bit of Congo Free State, or what they call today Congo Brazzaville. And you know what? He sold it to his country, Belgium. But it was rich in gold, timber, and other resources. Had its own peculiar resources. So the Berlin Conference, where were our traditional or cultural leaders at the time the Berlin Conference was taking place? They did about it. In fact, you could say they were almost surprised. They had a surprise attack by these imperial powers when their territories were being taken away. In fact, some agreements, which were called protection agreements, had been made on the understanding that probably those will be used to protect them against their enemies, only to realize that the interests were different. So they fought back in retaliation to reclaim their sovereignty. People like Mwanga, Kabaka Mwanga, Mukama Kabalega of the Nyoro, and others. So this historical problem or malaise or symptom is rooted in the various agreements that were signed with our rulers at that time, rulers or chiefs or kings, whatever the case could have been. And one of them was the 1894 Protectorate Agreement, the Uganda Agreement 1900, the Uganda Agreement 1955, the British agreements with Victoria and Colony and Bunyoro between 1900 and 1933, the Uganda Agreement 1961, other laws, colonial laws that were made. Now, what is of key note here is that, do you honestly think the people who signed these agreements on behalf of the African rulers and chiefs understood what these agreements were talking about, or the real ramifications of these agreements? Carl Peters, people like Lugard, Harry Johnston were awarded medals, and they have streets named after them back home. Maybe even here in Uganda, there's Fort Lugard, Fort Portal, Fort, and so on and so forth. But they did a lot of, injustice to us with this kind of agreements. In fact, I have read some notes and letters about the real meaning of these articles. Post-colonial and neo-colonial sense, our current political leaders. So you find that the current constitutions we have, the current constitution we have, has had how many predecessors? From 62 to 66 to 67. I think the 1905 constitution is the one which has survived about, almost 3 decades now? Almost 3. Is it almost 3 decades? No. It's about 20-something decades. Experience in his second exile, because he had been exiled in 53 when he challenged colonial authority. But most of the leaders, if you look at that picture, all of them, in fact, have gone to exile. They have lived in exile, they've suffered in exile, have returned from exile to rule. And possibly they could return to exile, and then someone else will come from exile, if we don't learn from our lessons. So, 67, so what happened in 66? 66, the Constitution, abolished the office of the President and Vice President. Also abolished, it's 67 which abolished traditional leadership or institutions and confiscated their properties like lands, monies, shares in companies, and so on and so forth. And also, 1967, abolished the federal system of government. So in our 62 constitution, a federal arrangement had been reached during the independence negotiations in England. We've heard of the Lancaster Conference and the Marlborough Conference. Those negotiations took place, and Ugandans sat at the table, 14 entities at the time, and agreed on what kind of system of governance would be suitable for them. So some preferred to be under a federal system, that is Uganda, Bunyoro, Toro, Ankole, and the territory of Busoga. And then the others preferred to be administered directly by the central government. and they were called districts, especially within the eastern and northern Uganda. So in '66, that is Prime Minister Obote, with disagreement with the President of Uganda, who was also Kabaka of Uganda, Edward Mutesa, had disagreements, and which disagreements involved their institutions. Eventually there was a crisis. In '67, cultural institutions are abolished, all of them. And a new constitution comes into place, and also their properties are taken away. In 1995, so between '67 to 1995, there were a number of governments that came up. Until 1995, when we had views collected by the local commission and then reduced into writing, and the constitution is promulgated, and since has been amended severally. Ugandans have been short-changed during this process. And these are the instances. One of them, if you read the parliamentary hazards, why the crisis happened, you'll find that there are accusations which are personal between the Prime Minister and the President of Uganda at that time. In 1967, there was introduction of unitary government or republicanism in full force, where we are all under one parliamentary system, one central government, one court system, one... What essentially the case was different in a federal relationship was that under a federal relationship, you find that Uganda, for example, had its own high court, had its own police force, even though they were accountable to those of the central government. You had how privileges are shared, who takes precedence, right, within a particular territory, and so on and so forth. So Ugandans have been short-changed. '67 actually is also an introduction of dictatorship in Uganda, and that spanned for a long period of time. And it was most catastrophic in Amin's regime and Obote the second regime. There were other laws that they made. You've heard of the 1975 Land Reform Decree and several other decrees, states of emergency, you know, really gagging people not to exercise their constitutional rights as far as governance is concerned. So during the process of 1995 constitution making, when the issue of federal was raised, the Commission thought it was controversial. When you look at pages 238, 239 of the report and 240, you'll find that there are views that the Commission mentioned, but I wanted just to highlight about two. The issue of whether Uganda should be governed under federal or unitary arrangements was debated very widely throughout the nation and emerged as one of the most controversial topics of a new constitution. Now the question is, what is controversial, what is not controversial, what parameters are using to call it controversial? Because views were collected, over 66% of Ugandans said they were in favor of federalism. And the balance said they were not. So, at one time, President Museveni was interviewed and was asked, why is it that if he was claiming that he was fighting for the people to retain their power and to exercise their views and rights, that when they had mentioned that they preferred federal, he shortchanged them with decentralization. He said, no, we understood what really people wanted. People did not want federal. They were calling it that, but they don't exactly want. What they wanted is to exercise their power locally. So what is essentially different with federalism? Because that's what it actually is all about. But because these instances of trying to, hold on to power and confusing citizens about their real rights of what they should be exercising. The education system, when there was war, massive killings, who had businesses, so on and so forth. Political refugees, murders of political opponents, etc., etc. There are also social symptoms. Mistrust, suspicion. This is one thing actually I always find whenever there is a large congregation of mixed ethnicities. People don't want to warm up easily. In fact, the common identifying language we have is English. But if they want to say something that they don't want you to hear, they will definitely say to you their language. Why that mistrust? Why that suspicion? That suspicion even happens during marriage, or even actually not before marriage, during courting or relating. As people relate, which tribe are you? Is it a tribe or a nation? Yeah? Because we've been also been deceived that these are tribes, but they're actually nations. Maybe with tribes. And we've been told Uganda is a nation. Far-fetched idea. We are in a nation building process, not yet there. But why would someone be uncomfortable marrying from a certain ethnicity? Why is it that even here you see certain ethnicities dominate? Administration, maybe student population or enrollment. And why are some not dominating? These are the symptoms I'm telling you about. Disunity. Many people have mentioned that the only time they've seen Ugandans united is when Uganda Cranes is playing. So all of them are in full force. After that, we are back to our cocoons. When's the other incident? I think when I was young, I used to think this independence celebration idea was actually understood by all Ugandans. But I think over time, we have, detracted from that. The sectarianism, and this is usually along tribal, religious, and other kind of lines. Discrimination. Let me talk about this sectarianism once I experienced. Now I have the name Mwesigwa, and I have the name such as Eve. So, when I've wanted to sometimes get a benefit, I use only Jonathan Mwesigwa. Why? Because the politics at play in the various institutions. If you are Mwesigwa, or Mwesigye, or I'm talking, if you generally identify with Western Uganda, you would get easy help or easy let go if you've done something wrong or something of the kind. So one time I was taken on as a research assistant at the industrial court, and the person told me, "Can you speak in Nyankole?" I said, "No." "How come you have the name Mwesigwa?" And I told them, "Well, it has nothing to do with Nyankole. It is an African Christian name. Stemming from the revival, East African revival. It has nothing to do with the indigenous names of Ankole or Chigezi, whatever." So they said, "That's the problem, because I told the person that the person who's coming is my relative." That was sad to hear, but thankfully my transcripts and everything just have Jonathan Mwesigwa, and those who don't subscribe to the mail should be should be forgiven and let go. There's wanton abuse of fundamental human rights and freedoms. This you've watched in newspapers, every day on television, you've read it, on the internet, the videos circulating. Wanton abuse of fundamental human rights and freedoms. Political, economic, social, cultural. We
could go on and mention. Despising or undermining others. So there's a superiority complex amongst certain ethnicities, especially where I come from. People have accused us of having a superiority complex over other people. And I found it quite true in many respects when I've heard people talking with others, especially in abusive language. Yeah. If someone wants to tell you that you're not thinking, they will say you are like a what? Don't mention. Because there is that imagination that they are thinking better than everyone else, which is, I don't think, something that would amuse God as well, because we are all equally created in His image. Self-entitlement. Self-entitlement. Bunyoro? Northern and the north. There is the area. Central Uganda, probably. There is, we talked about our self-reflection, jiggers. What else do people suffer from? Those kind of things. These are social symptoms of the malaise that has eaten us up, and we've not been proactive in addressing them. Then the economic symptoms, high poverty rates, exploitative, World Bank and IMF policies. You know, recently one of the ministers in the central government signed an agreement without reading it. I don't know if you remember that story. She signed an agreement without reading it, only to find out that it was exploitative of the country. Corruption, stealing from state coffers, uneventful economic programs, for example, Bonnaba Gagawale, Operation Wealth Creation. Before Bonnaba Gagawale, there was another one, which I've forgotten. But these seem to be like money-eating ventures, not really intended to help people or uplift them out of their poverty situation or their economic lowdown, but a political gimmick in an economic sense. Inequitable distribution of economic resources. When we get the national cake, how much does each region get? Are the resources equitably distributed to manage the challenges in those particular areas? Poor standards of living. This you can just go to Katanga, Waise. Here in Mkono there is sort of a slum in the town over there. Poor infrastructure development, low and national currency value. How much can you buy with 5,000 shillings? 10,000. If you're given 50,000, you know, how much can you do with it to uplift your situation? Vis-a-vis during a time when people went to school for a year paying about 600 shillings. Where does the rest of our money go? Foreign exchange, high import rates. There is another word they call poor balance. Balance of terms of what? Balance of payments. You know, inequalities in that, and so on and so forth. Now, why do I think that federalism is a therapy for this? One of the issues that I've found out is that generally Ugandans, we are at crossroads. First of all, on who should govern us and how we should be governed. We've not had an agreement point. If you look at all the leaders we've had, how have they come to power? Was it by consensus of the people? It was by barrel of the gun. Barrel of the gun. They fought their way into power. The only person who could probably have been elected by the people is the first president, because there was the constitutional in parliament subscribed that constitutional heads and traditional rulers could be the only ones eligible to be elected as presidents of Uganda. So there was an election in parliament, but that wasn't by people suffrage. They call human suffrage. Yeah. So what do they call it? Universal population suffrage? Universal suffrage. So, we are at crossroads, and we need to have a meeting point. You've heard about national dialogue, out of people power. That's another force out of there. There is another people's government. Then you've seen people trying to hold on to power. You've seen amendments, you've seen court trials, court decisions. There are many examples in the world that have the federal system, and they are quite united people. And this is actually the trend now in Africa. When you go to Kenya, they call them county governments. But those county governments exercise federal powers. In fact, we had a new constitution being made, a new constitution making process. But also at a national level, the problem has always been trying to identify with ourselves there first, without some people find the problem to identify as a group of belonging. It's not by mistake that God created us different. Some are dark, some people are light, others are tall, I am a bit shorter, others are big, I am smaller. We cannot be the same, just look at your fingers. There isn't a trouble. But even when they mention sentiments of unity and diversity, we're not sure what do they exactly mean. Is it just some what they throw at us, or they actually mean it? We need to identify with our cultural values at the local level first. Because we don't have really national values you could point out to and say this is Ugandan. Is it the dress code? Is it the language? Is it the way we behave? Is it the marriage? Is it, what is Ugandan about Uganda? What is Ugandan about Uganda? So if we, and this should start from the families. I've seen certain families where the father wants to dominate everything, wants to even be in the kitchen. Certain responsibilities should be even shared at a family level. If you don't start grooming children in that sense early enough, you're going to create problems at the top. As a father, you're the head of the family, so that's central government, but you've distributed power to the mother to manage the home on your behalf when you're not around or when you're away. So the mother can even distribute roles among the children. Make sure that the sitting room is, steadfast. Make sure the goat is slaughtered. And so on and so forth. Oil, water is fetched, and so on and so forth. That kind of responsibility being shared at a family level first, so that you can now take it to the village, up to the sub-county, county, and the national level. I think federalism will help create national unity, rule of law, because it helps stem away some power from central authorities, and it redistributes it so that it is evenly exercised. Some people are held accountable. Their constitution defines roles. What does the central government do? What do the regional governments do? And nobody should conflict in each other's roles. Effective and efficient application of laws and administration of justice. I've just told you about people who will be more compliant to people they are most loyal to. Let me just give you an example. Kawaka birthday run. How many people turned up? Then if you compare with Parliament is also organizing a run, and has organized some runs before. So that's a representative of the central government. How many people have participated? You need to muscle this loyalty to the national level by recognizing that those traditional leaders as well, or cultural leaders, or other kind of leaders, have constitutional roles to play in the administration of the country. Regional competitiveness. Because we are not equally endowed in regions. Some people have oil, And by the way, Bunyoro, when federal negotiations were going, or discussions or agitation was going on, was saying we don't want federal. Now, today, they are claiming for federal. Part of the misconceptions that I told you about that are fueled by politicians and other people. So some people have oil, some people have gold. I'm sure they're exporting a bit of gold from Karamoja in Mubende. Some people have iron ore. If Kasese had known better, there wouldn't be food, that there is no more. What is it? What is the resource that was being exploited there? In Kasese? Copper. So they were told that there's now cobalt, but now studies show there's actually more copper there. So when regions have different abilities, resources, there is a bit to do better than the other, to provide more for your people than they, to do, even have an opportunity to admire or to model certain things after a certain state. It is possible to learn from others. But also that's a way of creating sustainable development within those particular regions, because they know what best is needed there and will definitely allocate the budget to those particular needs. Independent legislative and policy-making institutions. For example, we have the national parliament now making laws for the whole of the country. But have the Luchiko, the Urugato, I don't know what they call it in Acholi, and their equivalents, making laws and regulations for governance within their own communities, because they understand the challenges there best, and perhaps some of these things have been handled culturally before, and the people are there, but now it is just to modernize a bit. I've just told you we have had cultural disputes settled before, a cultural court. But now we have even a record of proceedings. So and so has appeared, and these are the witnesses, this is the evidence. It is recorded. Such but when it is taken to the final arbitrator or arbiter, the Kabaka, he has a record to refer to, not hearsay evidence. So it can be developed. Individual participation in democratic governance and accountability. Federalism will allow us this opportunity. This is not far-fetched. Let me just give you an instance. Some of the best schools we had in Uganda, it wasn't because necessarily they were being given more money to be run by their boards of governors or their managements. No. These schools have been, first of all, in the land on which they were located, they were donated, the land was donated by the region within the which they were found. We could mention Budo, King's College Budo, Gayaza, I think Musuka College Mwiri, I think there is one in northern Uganda, is it Boroboro? Was it Boroboro? I think high school, I think Milton Obote went to Boroboro. And so on and so forth. Do you know what would happen? The county chief, at least here in Uganda, I know, was accountable to the Minister of Education and had to do around amongst those schools and give a report within his county about the status or state of those schools and what needed to be changed or what needed to be done to ensure that they are better managed. But there was also attachment to them. In fact, many people strive to join them from wherever they are. And even when you go to those local schools deep down there, you find that their level of education at the time is much better than what we have today. Why? The communities themselves, if the headmaster says we don't have rooms, message sent, rooms will be found. Is it a matter of getting some soil, is it a mud, cow dung, and they mix it with soil and to give it a fresh, or to control jiggers and everything. They would do it. They would plant trees. They would attend meetings, and so on and so forth. And they would participate in local government of their communities. Bulungi wansi, things have just deteriorated, actually, but they were better managed under that kind of system because people were accountable, both the leaders and the led. Thank you for listening to me. I'll be glad to take.
Thank you so much. Million people. You can't compare that to the rest of the country. I also feel that we are stronger economically as a group, as a big group, and not divided. You stated that there are 11. Okay. There will definitely be challenges with administration because how many people are administering as a small group? Let's say the Batwa. Okay. Very small, not even 500,000 people. So
Okay, so let me take one by one as you want. So
let me take three at once I can.
I think, yeah, thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome, sir.
I had really many things to raise, but I don't think I'll do that. I'm just thinking about the stage at which we are as a nation. It already feels like trying to propose a federal system of government is like working backwards. You made reference to the US, and the brief history I know about the US is actually federalism did not work like that. I think the states were already independent and they chose to unite. But in our case, we are already united, and the proposal is to find a way of decentralizing us again and form a federal government or system of federalism. And I think that in itself is complicated because that will really take a lot to have people buy into the idea of federalism and want to, because already there are many sentiments that are contrary to federalism. So that's one thing that I just thought about. And then secondly is political will. I think that is our greatest setback. I think there is no political will to have federalism work. If there was, I do think that would not even be advocating for federalism, because we already have a decentralized system of governance. And if decentralization is not working, then I don't see a theoretical idea of federalism working. I think that if we were really serious about the ideals of federalism, then we would now be seeing them in a decentralized system of government. But if we are not seeing them, then that means we're just going to go back to the same place.
And some of them might be questions. You know which ones are questions in your team. But I think part of mine will be response to what I'm hearing, and we push the edge a little further. One, which are we referring it to? The state, the nation, or the country in talking about federalism? I think we easily merge the boundaries of these concepts and so miscommunicate what we intend to really say about what we're saying. In your case of the Kabalka's birthday, I think the multinationals have successfully infiltrated the cultural institution, and I think Airtel sells a lot, much more than the Kabalka himself. That may not be the way how they see it, but from my observation, I think it's a very hot spot to market, which is the multinational company ruling the land. And that is very interesting. Even take it further. Just watch how Nambole, for example, has been conquered by Airtel. For you to find what you call as Uganda cream, it is a far-fetched idea. So your ramifications of fear of which economy will be, I think there is a question to handle differently in that sense.
Okay.
But I like the two questions you asked, and I think they are the most critical. One is, who should govern us? And two is, how should we be governed? And I think up to now, these two questions have not been fully satisfactorily answered. Because if you turn to the state and ask who should govern us and how should they be governed, and then to the nation, who should govern us and how should we be governed, and the country, they will give different feedbacks in its state. And maybe finally is that there is something about culture that I've learned over time, and the level of civilization within our cultures. That should be, I think, a more grounding point for us to think of governing ourselves. Because the fears of how many tribes, how many people, how many nations is a different fear, but there are places that have many people. If you go to India, if you go to Germany, it's more complex than Uganda. But when you talk about a federated Germany, a country called India, and the number of people in it is too many to refer to. Even America, when you refer it as America, if you move in terms of tribes and people,
yes,
it is so complex.
Ethnicity.
It's very complex. And so the idea of federalism as a therapy, which is the term used, as a therapy to deal with politics. I wonder who, in this sense, should be the therapist.
Thank you very much. And the economically viable, considering the many tribes we have in Uganda, vis-a-vis 11 states. Now this is, first of all, let me start with the tribes. So you find that one would say the Baganda are a tribe. But when you do a study, actually, they are not. They are not. Yeah. They are not. And because, okay, you could even go to Banyola, where the Baganda came from. Or if we leave the Banyola and go to the Bachwezi, where the Banyola came from. This tribe description is intentional, guy. Whoever sat in Berlin, it is one of the ways we used to divide and rule. Otherwise, what we call tribes are actually collections of the nations, collections of different ethnicities. In Uganda alone, the Baganda, whom I will tell you they are not original Baganda, because there is no such in Uganda.
And there's none.
And there will be none.
There's none.
But through conquests, they gained more territory and assimilated more people who became also Baganda. I come from Sese. We are not originally part of Uganda. In fact, we are considered demigods of Uganda. A very pricey county in Uganda. The Banyala, the Bakuji, Dr. Samuel is Muluri. But he's a Muganda. So is Uganda a tribe? No, it's not. Even though there could be variances here, because with the Bakochi, for example, we have variances. They have their language. They were, in fact, allowed to speak their language. But they were subsumed within the state of Uganda as a county. They were formerly a kingdom. And they agreed to that, and their king agreed to become the equivalent of a county chief. The only difference is that he was hereditary. And he was given finances to administer from Mengo I was even given a special seat within Mwesigwa because of the peculiarities of where he was coming from. So there is that understanding. So for me, instead of going for 60 tribes, I would rather propose 11 states to manage our economics there. The fear that one would be stronger than the other, it is true, but what happens under the federal arrangement is that the strong ones contribute to the national purse, which is called the consolidated fund, where finances are redistributed to help even the economically poorer states. That's the idea behind it. So that you don't take it for always. The truth of the matter is that none of them will ever equal. There will always be a stronger one than the rest. But we at least want an average of economic viability in all the regions. So that when there is a service in Ankole, that same service I can find it in Karamoja, notwithstanding the distance between the two, notwithstanding the weather condition, notwithstanding anything. They can equally reach Karamoja safely, secure, buy pizza from Karamoja. I don't know whether it is there today. But we want that kind of semblance. So this fear is not very valid. It can be worked on. The rich give more to the poor, just like you tax the rich more to subsidize for the poor. State, we are in as a nation. Like I say, we are at a crossroads. And Reverend Fed has just emphasized two aspects here. Who should govern us? How should we be governed? We are at crossroads as a country about these particular two questions. But are we working backwards? You will discover that actually during the period when we had exercised federalism in Uganda between 1960, perhaps about 1961, when we had internal self-government, just about the time when the colonists were about to leave, for about 1964, 65, that is the most economically stable period for Uganda. You can read reports that will be telling you it is, even before independence, the British were saying it is the most promising territory for the British Empire. That was the period. Why? They encouraged production within the states, affairs to be managed by their own people. Because what really the British found here was that we were already organized in our different areas. They often want to elevate a bit of Uganda, but it was true in Ankole, it was true in Buyuru, it was true in Acholi. They had their own system of governance, which in fact they used to divide the people and to exploit them. So I don't think it is working on workers. But even once we borrow this model of federalism, it should be with modifications to suit our local circumstances. We don't want to copy wholesale what is in the US. We want to make sure that in Uganda we have cultural institutions with their cultural leaders, and even more being created. How are we going to deal with, if we get tempted to apply it the same way the US applies when they don't have the monarchy, the same monarchy there, we will be running into what Americans call that word. State formation in Uganda is undergoing a process, and one of the reasons why there's no political will is because the successors of our colonizers are doing precisely the same thing. They don't want to share power, they want to divide us along these things, which we call tribes and all these terminologies, and so on and so forth. So the political will is not there because they have their personal interests in this country. You've heard one of them saying, I went to the bush to kill my own animal. I cannot just let it go, but to be shared by anybody. You know? So those are the challenges we have to deal with. Decentralization which they're trying to use and which you say has failed to work, and I agree with you, is actually because it is a copycat from the Uganda mode of administration. And decentralization works very well under federalism. I will tell you that during the time of Katikkiro Sibira, all the 20 counties, then including the Ugandans, had well-built administrative structures, which the central government was hanging on to date. Luchiko Hall, offices, and Senza Chief House, with trees, with acres of land where they can do economic activities, each distributed with 8 square miles of land. Decentralization was working. In fact, that Uganda modern administration was transferred to the rest of Uganda. You know, Kakungulu doing it in Bali, you know, in Akole. They have these things. So what hasn't worked is that the central government has retained the power over economic resources, but also over decisions which those districts have to make. And the influence which should be even elected there. So people cannot be as loyal to them as would be the case to those whom we traditionally know. Reverend Feta mentions about this timing. This is a very careful route to take when using, I agree with you, but I'm referring to the country Uganda, which has a state managed by people who don't want to share power with the rest of the country, who are not eager to build us toward a nation. Airtel versus Kabaka, multinational companies. Well, I might not agree with you, and in fact I don't agree with you on that. Multinationals are not necessarily infiltrating Mengo or the kingdom. We have invited them specifically and entered into memorandums of understanding with them. But there is a social cost, because you see the cultural leaders have been limited in how much they can serve their people. They don't collect taxes. Do you know how they even survive? When Kabaka Mutevya just returned as a priest to Uganda, his car used to run out of fuel. So they will have to run to Mr. So-and-so owns Shell, please, and so on and so forth. But we've tried to transform that by trying to create economic basis for ourselves. Because we have also our own initiatives in corporate affairs, in media, in land management and estates, in social and economic development, and so on and so forth. So what has happened is this. We have the numbers, we have the market. It would be wise for anyone who wants to do business to come to Mengo, because one word from the Kabaka would just send the signal to the right channels. Just one word. And I think it would be a little, I don't want to use the words like stupid, foolish, for a multinational who wants a market to ignore that particular fact. The statistics show how many people listen to radio, in what language, how many adverts are done, in what language. When you want to promote any product, just find even Airtel, Juza, what is the one for MTN, and so many others. In fact, when Airtel struck a deal with us, MTN was coming, trying to offer a better one. But we had already had one, so we told Airtel to up its game. So our fear is not because I think it is good to cooperate. This is one sign, because Airtel has brought on not only Uganda but also non-Ugandans within the region to benefit from these kind of services, and we benefit from Airtel as well. And I think it is a good way to continue working. Who should govern us? National dialogue should help us sort this one out, because, like I said, we are at crossroads. How should we be governed? Same thing. Because we are different societies with different systems of governance which we're used to. But those can all, we can get something good from each one of them, from what can be a unique model. Because you know what the advantage with federalism is that it works especially with institutions or regions that are multi-ethnic. It best works there. But because if we had been all the same, there wouldn't be a reason why we do it this way. Who should be the therapist? I think that's a rhetorical question. Yeah, but that's how
Yeah, well, let's thank our speaker for today. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Please come back next week on Thursday, 2 to 4:30. We will be in Academic Sport Room. So you're most welcome. Thank you everyone for coming.